I am being watched. Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about Person of Interest, Season 3, Episode 18. It's called Allegiance. So spoilers for the episode. And this one is a good episode, but it's not an amazing episode, which means that it's probably one of the weakest episodes of the season because the season's been firing on so many cylinders, like all the time. Like there's been like one or two slightly lesser episodes, and it's not that this is bad, but I mean there's a lot of good things in this. There's a insane jump out of a window that comes out of nowhere from Reese that was quite good looking, honestly, from what they showed. Like I was kind of into the insanity of that moment, but it kind of suffers a little bit from the backstory needing a lot of exposition, which is not particularly exciting to hear. Like there's a lot of like just explaining things in scenes. And it suffers from a couple of really obvious plot, I won't call them twists, but revelations, swerves. You know, one of the most common things that happens in a Person of Interest episode, and I've brought it up a lot, is the early part of an episode when we're doing a typical Case of the Week style episode, is that typically the first thing that is the obvious thing that's going on, right? The first thing the team assumes is happening, where they assume that the character they're following is clearly this person who's about to do this bad thing, or is a good person who's doing this thing. It's very common in Person of Interest for about a third into the episode for it to be very quickly revealed that that assumption was wrong, and that the person we thought was more likely to be good is actually bad, and the person we thought was bad is actually the good guy. And it's done it a lot. It did it in the pilot. It's been doing it the whole time. It does it in this episode, and it's one of the more egregious versions of it because they really lay it on thick, where they think the woman they're following is a terrorist or working for a terrorist cell, and they're really kind of laying it on. She's taking these secret phone calls and arranging meetings, and it seems like she's lying to her boss, and she's like a government or a UN contractor, and it all feels very fishy. But Finch does point out quite early on that, wait, we think this woman might be a terrorist. That doesn't make sense. That's a relevant number. We wouldn't be getting that if it was at that. Now, admittedly, it was open to the possibility that maybe something's wrong with the machine, and maybe we'll find out because they've got a relevant number that something's not quite right. So it could have been setting something up in that side of things. But once it's revealed, no, this woman is actually just trying to help get someone asylum, right? Someone like her, turns out her boyfriend, effectively, is being detained under suspicion of terrorism for a lot of reasons, which we'll get into. But all she was doing was trying to get like a lot of evidence to help him, and all she was doing by following this guy from the UN, who I think was Gideon from Mr. Robot, the actor, which was cool, I guess. But she just wanted to go and deliver him some evidence and make her case. It's a little bit harassy, but not particularly villainous, right? She's not like, cause you spend the whole time thinking this envelope might have an explosive in it, and then it turns out not to be the case. I did feel myself rolling my eyes a little bit at that, just because they really laid it on so thick, and I'm like, yeah, man, you really tried to get over the idea that this woman was dangerous. But to be honest, the entire time I kind of felt like, nah, this is going to swerve. She's actually innocent, and we're going to actually be rooting for whatever she's doing once we find out what it is. The bigger one that bugged me though in this episode is that there's a character who shows up to like help her, another UN. So the main UN guy, I think it's meant to be French. There's another UN guy who shows up and kind of helps her and shows that he's concerned, he's kind of compassionate in the few scenes that he has. And to be honest, the blatant he is clearly a villain that's acting nice is so all over his face that it didn't make any scene with this character, again, a little bit eye-rolly, a little bit, okay, I think all of these, like, more exaggerated problems that a lot of episodes are guilty of a little bit in Person of Interest, but you kind of go with it because it's written so well. I think this one suffers a little bit for maybe having just too many characters that it needs to play with and set up, because you've got the main Person of Interest, you've got her boss, who also is a villain, right? You've not even mentioned him yet, but he's secretly part of this whole villainous scheme. You've got the UN guy who's approving or disapproving the asylum-seeking status of, like, her lover. You've got him, the lover, right? The guy who's been held on suspicion of terrorism, seeking asylum. And then you've got this other UN guy who's going to try and maybe help her, but turns out to be a bad guy. That's a lot of characters, and that's all new characters. That's all guest stars for this episode before we even get to any of our main cast and everything they're doing. And we do have a lot in this episode with the whole team. You know, Shaw kind of takes point in this one. Good fair amount of stuff with Fusco. Reese takes a little bit of a backseat, but he's around. Funch, of course. Even Root gets a subplot. It's mostly the start and the end of the episode. It kind of bookends, and her stuff is quite intriguing, to be fair. But it's maybe got just a few too many characters, so they end up being a little thinner than I find the writing in this show tends to be. I tend to actually find myself pleasantly surprised with how much depth the writers of this show are able to extract out of the guest stars or the guest characters on a given regular episode of the show. And this is just an example where there was maybe just too many to juggle, and they all kind of came across a little bit thinner as a result. So I do think it drags the episode down a little bit, and I wasn't finding myself as invested in the actual main plot as much as I normally am. But it's not bad by any means. There's still, like I say, a lot of fun moments to enjoy. The team interacting. Pretty much every pairing of characters from the main team get a little bit of back and forth, and like I said earlier, the big jump out the window from Reese when they're trying to protect her, because, you know, the main person's attacked as often. I like the build up to that, even where Shaw finally goes up and gets into the elevator with her, because up until that point she'd been keeping her distance. There was no like interacting with the person up until that point. But she gets into the elevator because she realizes an assassin's followed the suspect in, and she basically just points out that he's an amateur for using chloroform, and then has a fight right in front of Maria's the person of interest, so I've got her name for something. So yeah, I did a double take when I saw the actress's name who plays Maria. Her name is Nazneen Contractor, and the only reason why I did a double take is because she's a contractor in this episode, which is purely coincidental, but it's such a weird coincidence that I legitimately thought that IMDb had glitched and it was just pulling like the word from somewhere else in the description of the episode. You know, I thought it was a glitch in the IMDb, but I googled her and her name does seem to be Contractor, so fair enough. But yeah, so we got Uncle Nolan in this episode, and plus, you know, I always love an excuse to quote Lethal Weapon 2 with diplomatic immunity, because that is brought up in this episode, because we're dealing with a UN building and diplomats who have said diplomatic immunity. So I do enjoy that. But yeah, definitely not as like a fine-tuned like episode as I often I remember what was that episode that I kind of like praised, not for being like a great story of an episode, but just how well it was constructed. The one about the baseball earlier this season, where I gushed over the execution of that episode, even if it wasn't that important or special as an episode on its own in terms of plot. But it was so well done. This to me is the opposite end of that a little bit, where it's just a little bit rougher around the edges because it's juggling too much. But yeah, so to get into it, the main sort of gist of it, like I said, this woman Maria is trying to get asylum status for this guy who's been held. What's his name? Omar was his name, and he is being detained in a prison until the UN guy that's in charge of like approving of this does so. But there's a whole conspiracy thing where there's like a fake letter from Iraq saying that he's actually a terrorist, but it was actually written by Maria's boss, who was secretly on a previous like trip to Iraq, like selling the generators that were meant to go to help a hydro dam, you know, fuel an entire city, right? You know, give energy to an entire city. Instead, he made a shady deal with someone to ship the generators elsewhere, and this where they went wasn't a surprise. I immediately said, I bet it's to do with Samaritan and the other machine, and sure enough, we see a meeting with Uncle Nolan a little bit later. I got a laugh because when Root is trying to follow Uncle Nolan, at one point, he successfully gives her the slip, and she grabs like the arm of another random older man. And her line is, "Sorry, I thought you were my uncle," made me laugh, just purely because I keep referring to John Greer as Uncle Nolan, because I think it's funny. So it was almost like somehow the writers could see into the future and knew that I'd be referring to him as Uncle Nolan and give me a line just to tickle my fancy. In fact, maybe it even was an intentional line because Jonathan Nolan's working on the show and he actually put that in because literally the bad guy is played by his uncle. But regardless, yeah, there's a lot of introducing a lot of these characters, of course, in the team. When I talk about there being a lot of characters, I think a good example of that in this episode is by the time we introduce the other UN guy who's being nice to Maria, and it cuts back to Finch, and like Finch is always doing, he's taping the pictures of the faces up on the glass board. By the time he does that, there's like a row of like 5 faces at this point. And I know technically there's been times where, we've had names of like 30 police officers, so there's like a bunch of faces, but they're not all characters we actually meet in the episode. No, in this episode, we get introduced to each one of these names and faces as they come up one by one, so they're all prominent enough figures to have an introduction, either because we meet them or because they're heavily mentioned during some of the early phone calls or whatever it is. But yeah, so I mean, I'm trying to think about what I even want to say about the rest of the main plot. There's a whole part where after they save her, they kind of hide her out back at Finch's place, or Reese's place, I think, technically, with the big safe door. And she actually gives Shaw the slip by running away, but sabotaging the electrical panel so it traps Shaw inside as she tries to run to the UN. There's also a big kind of finale thing where they need to get into the UN and they come up with a plan. Reese specifically comes up with a plan of faking being firefighters, and Shaw fires in a smoke grenade to make them fall the fire brigade. So they roll in, and Fusco's cracking lines about wanting to be a fireman. It's all very fun and nice, and a couple of decent little fight moments. Fusco even kind of looks kind of cool. In fact, in the initial attack on Maria, the one that ends with the jump out the window, Fusco even gets a cool entrance in that, where he comes in and a terrorist, or a legionnaire I think it is technically, swings a knife at him and he ducks out the way and then punches the guy. And I'm like, Fusco's starting to get a little closer to Reese status. He's still a long way away, but I feel like he's a lot more physically capable than I think I thought of him as back in the first season at the very least. So nice to see a little bit of an evolution there. So anyway, back to later on in the episode, Maria's escaped and is trying to get into the UN so she can find the original forged letter that's in the UN guy's office, which is where all the big finale stuff happens, and the other UN guy turns out to be a villain, which is, again, the most obvious thing ever. While she's escaping and going to do that, it's right around the same time that Reese and Fusco have actually broken out, because Omar was about to get shipped back, and Finch met him initially and very quickly convinced him that he was trustworthy, which, to be fair, he brings up Maria and the fact that Maria was almost killed, so Omar immediately starts to talk, even though he's adamant he's not going to, because clearly he doesn't want to talk to anyone here. He doesn't trust anyone. And again, it's maybe a little bit rushed just how quickly Finch earns his trust, because again, we have so much to do in the episode. But he actually gets freed by Reese and Co. So he actually comes with Reese and Finch, or sorry, Reese and Fusco, I should say. He comes with Reese and Fusco when they come in the fire engine to come and try and help save the day at the end. So he has his big reunion with Maria, and at the end he gets his asylum status confirmed, and he gets to stay in New York, and they have a romantic dinner together at the restaurant where Shaw's her parents had their first date. So it's kind of sentimental for her. And her doing, recommending something out of sentiment is kind of interesting. And it's perhaps the most interesting part of the entire main story is the moment that she has one-on-one with Maria, where Maria's saying, you don't understand, they're going to kill him if they send them back to Iraq. And Shaw kind of steps in and says, no, my mother, would have been killed by radicals if someone hadn't snuck her out and got her to America. And kind of tying a little bit into Shaw thinking about her own past and her own heritage was definitely, I think, the most interesting part to me. And often the most interesting part of any random episode of Person of Interest is how things tie back into the main characters and what they're going through. And it's not like our main characters haven't been in positions where they look like the bad guys and they're actually trying to do something right. In fact, we find out that Omar's not only just a great guy, but he actually saved Maria's life in an attempted attack when she was in Iraq. So there's a lot of like things to kind of paint the picture of what's going on. There's just a lot of it to actually get to and exposit, and it takes some time, and it's maybe not quite as smooth as a typical episode. But it does raise the question though at the end when Fusco comes up and says, "Hey, good news! Your asylum seeker status has been approved." I did think, like, was there no fallout of like him being like of him being broken out from custody when he's in the transport van? I mean, I guess like Finch did some hacking and Fusco somehow cleared some of it up, but I feel like there'd be questions being asked. Like, even if it turns out the original letter was a forgery and he's completely innocent, it feels like the sort of thing that someone in the system would be like, yeah, but you escaped custody from the police, so we're just not going to let you in. Maybe I'm being too cynical there, but it felt like a question they just kind of glossed over because we already have too much to do in this episode and we can't really deal with that. So, yeah, a lot of things to juggle, a lot of characters, could be smoother. The subplot, and I did like Root contacting Finch a little bit and like giving him a couple of tips here or there, and Finch is like, wait, how did you know I needed that tip? Well, of course, because the machine could tell you needed that tip. You need the password to this thing. So in comes Root with a phone call. Hey, the password's this. That's kind of funny, and Root borrows a dog. And I really like the bookend nature to this. So she's tracking Uncle Nolan. And we get this big sequence at the start where she's following him through the subway station, and like the machine's helping her keep track of him, right? But as we've seen before, and I love that this is something they keep bringing back, is how do we combat the machine? Uncle Nolan tells his people to engage various measures to stop it. First of all, he has them shut off all the cameras in the station, so there's no visual. But then the next step of that is the machine's tracking him by sound, right? The idea that the machine can actually identify which footsteps are his. So he says countermeasure 2, like make some noise. So all of a sudden there's extra footstep sounds coming out of the speakers to disguise his footsteps. And then number 3 is the machine tries to use GPS on his phone, but all he does is say that he's going dark, and he slips his phone into some stranger's pocket, and he gets away. He's able to escape Root, so even with all the advantage the machine gives her, she wasn't able to get to him. During the episode, Root comes round and borrows the dog. It says, I'm taking your dog, I'll bring him back. At the end of the episode, they basically repeat the same scene from the start in the same locations. They're going to the subway, same measure, countermeasure. But of course, what Root has done is she's brought Bear to smell him. And this is something that he can't really combat. She's brought the natural method, right? This is not a technology-based tracking system. This is just an animal using its natural senses to keep him... I thought that was a really fun thing. Like, the moment it clicked for me, right? I don't even remember exactly what moment it was, but it was a really nice moment when it clicked why she brought the dog. I'm like, right, because you can't fight that. Like, the old natural ways still have advantages when all else fails. So they end up having this meeting where she goes down the stairs in this quiet part of the station, and he's just standing there waiting for her. And of course, because the machine can't really keep track of anything here with all these countermeasures, 2 other guys sneak up behind her, so she doesn't have the advantage she thought she had. And it ends up being, as he puts it, a tie, and decides to leave. But he doesn't have her killed, because he tries to convince her to switch sides and join him, because she can also see what's coming. And he's not going to bore her with conversations about rival civilizations and blah, blah, blah. But it kind of ends on this ominous note of like, will Root be tempted? Will Root actually see that he might want something that she can connect with? Now, admittedly, I don't think they're actually going to go down that path, because as she herself says, she wants the machine to be free. He wants to control it. And he makes a case for that. He says, oh, it's all about, information is the new currency. Once upon a time it was, gold, oil, whatever. Now it's information, and someone has to control it, blah, 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 blah. It's a good scene. It ends on this ominous note of her looking like she's concerned, and I think maybe it's trying to convince you that she's considering perhaps what he's just said. Will she have doubts? Will she be tempted at some point based on maybe other decisions that the main team make or the machine makes, perhaps? I'm not convinced it's going to do that, and it's just kind of an ominous note to leave on. But it is intriguing that Uncle Nolan could have just had her killed, and we saw him already just kill someone. He killed Maria's boss, right? Maria's boss thought he was getting paid for a job well done, and Uncle Nolan's cleaning up his loose ends, making sure there's no trace back to him. So at the end, when he's like, "I'm leaving you alive because I hope next time we meet, you'll maybe consider my offer." That's intriguing. The idea that he sees value in Root in some way. Maybe it's because Root is this wild card who is using the current machine to get a lot of things done. He's seen how effective she is, and maybe it would just be less of a headache if she's on the same team. Maybe there's more to it than that, but it was an intriguing way to end the episode. For me, though, the big thing that I thought was fun was one, just giving Root and this like main villain now a big moment together, because it really makes it feel like Root is solidified as one of the main characters at this point. But also just the general mechanics of repeating the opening section again of like, okay, this is the measures that the machine uses to track him. One by one, he counters them, but then the dog's sense of smell is ultimately unbeatable. And I thought that was a fun way to show that and play that out. That was a really good example of conveying information, not dumbing it down for the audience. It just, because you probably get it before she says, "All right, Bear, where did he go?" And Bear is able to do it. It doesn't feel, it doesn't feel clunky. It feels like a very nice, natural way to sort of grasp it. Because, like I said, part of the fun was the moment it clicked why she brought the dog, which I think for most people will be before it explicitly shows you with her asking, "Hey, Bear, where did he go?" So I think that's pretty good. Yeah. That said, though, if I'm picking a scene of the episode, it's tough because in a weird way, it probably is the one-on-one scene with Shaw and Maria, where Shaw actually opens up about her past and makes it clear that she understands she's not going to abandon her. I do love the jump out the window. I also love the there's another sort of like two-part conversation between Shaw and Fusco, where Shaw basically criticizes Fusco for not knowing a lot about other cultures and other countries, and even makes fun that his honeymoon wasn't actually to a different country technically, because it was the U.S. Virgin Islands, and he doesn't really have much of a thing to say. But at the end of the episode, he makes this point about how that's what's so great about New York. You don't have to really go anywhere to learn about all the other cultures because they all come here. So it almost felt a little bit like an advert for tourism in New York at the end, where he said that, and then the shot of like the happy couple and the camera goes out to the skyline of New York City. A little bit like touristy ad, but you know what? This has been the home of the show for like 2.5 seasons. Well, it's almost 3 seasons now, where we're getting near the end of the season at this point. And it felt like New York's kind of a character in the show itself. Like, and yeah, we have seen such a variety of different types of people in the show at this point. So I don't know. It felt like a nice episode from that sentiment of this being a haven, of this being a place where maybe innocent people can find a new home. Like, there's kind of that idea of the American dream, the immigration, all that stuff. As much as it's challenged by so many things in the modern world, there was a nice sentiment to that. But that said, though, probably the one-on-one scene with Shaw and Maria is my scene of the week. Although the jump out the window definitely got close. That said, though, rating-wise, I'm probably going to slap this with a very solid 7 out of 10. I can't go any higher than that because I think it's a little bit clunkier and a little bit messier in terms of how it juggles all of its elements, and I think it diminishes a few of the characters and their impact. Like, I think maybe more time to actually care about the relationship between Maria and Omar would have went a long way, because ultimately we have like barely 2 scenes with them by the end, and I don't think it really landed where I felt like them carrying. I think introducing him a little bit earlier in the episode, maybe trying to slim down on the characters a little bit, would have helped. But hey, still not bad. 7 out of 10. It's good. So, yes, I'll be back next time with more Person of Interest. Thank you very much for joining me, everyone. I do appreciate it. You can, of course, support the channel and the show and keep all the content and reviews coming, both here and over at MailFuzz Movies, by over to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and supporting over there. And you get some bonus content, some bonus monthly shows. And yeah, like I said, the movie channel, MailFuzz Movies, worth checking out for various movie podcasts that are over there. There's a horror movie podcast, a sci-fi movie podcast, and a sort of a general sort of franchise and theme podcast. So go check out all that stuff, and thank you very much for joining me once again. Like, subscribe, ding the bell, all the usual YouTube shit that I'm sure you're sick of hearing about now. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?